So I trained in New Delhi in India, and one of the people who was ahead of me at medical school was Dr. Matthew Verghese, who's the guest lecturer today. Now, we all have people, and we look at their practice and say, I would like to do that. But we make compromises in our life because we get married, or we have children, or we like to drive cars. But some people stay completely faithful to the reasons they joined medicine. And the presidential guest lecturer today is one of them. So he has, when we were medical students, on Saturdays and Sundays, the rest of us used to have a good time, have a line. He used to work in a leper colony because leprosy still has a huge stigma in India. And he used to go arrange for them to have funds, arrange operations for them, and he still does that to this day. He's been running the polio ward in Delhi since 1990, and he has a huge workload. So this is a man who's in hospital at 6 o'clock in the morning, goes home at midnight. He lives with his mother, looks after her, and his sole interest is the care of the underprivileged. The numbers of polio cases he treats now have come down to about 150, but the trouble is that they come from all over India to him because he has a reputation of being caring, which unfortunately is not always the case there. So since we left medical school, he would have operated on over 10,000 cases of post-polio residual paralysis and managed over 20,000. That's a number I can't even think about. Unfortunately, in India, if you work with the underprivileged and you are not politically well connected, you are completely ignored by the establishment. So we have known that Matthew has been doing this for the last 25 years. And we smile at him and we call him our local Gandhi because that's his persona, as you'll see. It was only when Bill Gates noted him as one of the 5 people who have changed the practice of medicine and who have a missionary zeal in treating the underprivileged that he's come to the attention of the Indian government, and he has only worked in India. So this is an article that was written about him, and once these things came out, people started going onto YouTube and Googling and finding out that there have been individuals who've been very influenced by what he's done and who know what he does. He runs one of the largest single-day clubfoot clinics with over 70 to 80 clubfoot children on a single day. He's the honorary medical director of Cure International India, which is a non-governmental organization that runs clubfoot clinics across the whole of India. That's a population of 1.4 billion people. I don't want to say anything more about Matthew because I'd like you to welcome him to the stage and listen to a man whose whole life has been treating the underprivileged. Matthew.
Thank you, Nanu, for that embarrassingly flattering introduction. I am overwhelmed and I'm humbled because so many of my well-wishers are sitting there in front of me, especially my teacher, Dr. Anil Dhall, is sitting here. And all of you distinguished delegates and faculty from across UK and the rest of the world are sitting here. When Ananda sent this letter to me, I wondered what I can speak on, which would have any interest for people from this part of the world. After much deliberation and after the last date was over, I gave this topic, Orthopedics in an Unequal World. And I share with you my journey. I wish I could put from knowledge to wisdom. But I thought about it. It gives the impression I'm a wise man. I don't think I'm wise. I'm still on my journey. This world, it is an unweeded garden. The world is unequal in so many ways. In something as basic as drinking water, 30% of people across the world do not have access to safe drinking water. 60% of people across the world do not have access to safe sanitation. If you look at the old world disease of tuberculosis, there is a rising trend now. Not just new cases, but relapsed cases, MDRs and XDRs. That's troubling everyone. Looking at obesity in the 5 to 19 years of age, we find there's a sharp increase in the high-income countries and a moderate increase both in the middle-income and the low-income countries. Health consumption has grown exponentially, but that did not mean that people were healthier. The US healthcare is 20% of the national income, the most expensive in the world. Europe is not very far behind at 10 to 12% of the national income. What we must remember is we no longer live in an insular, small-scale community, but in an interconnected global community. And many of its important facets are not necessarily intuitive and easily observable. Economic inequality, both from income from labor and income from capital, both have an influence on human life, human health. In my own country, 1 million children in India die before their first birthday. I deal with a spectrum of orthopedic problems, adult, pediatric, geriatric, the full spectrum. In these times of super specialization and subspecialization, it is odd to be a generalist. But my calling in my hospital needs that I be a generalist. Thinking of what are we called to be doing as physicians. Role as orthopedic surgeon, providing primary orthopedic care, whether operating, treating, managing. And as we manage, we try to innovate and do things. Many of us are called to do research work. Maybe in creating evidence base, maybe in creating the future of orthopedic medicine and surgery. Many of us are called to be academicians. We also have, we must not forget, a public health role and a social responsibility. Many people ask me, what do you do as an orthopedic surgeon? And I introduce myself as a social orthopedic surgeon. I'm recognized as a polio surgeon and often ask the question, do you still see polio? Yes, I do still see polio, and I still have a ward of 8 beds reserved for polio patients. And that was started by my teacher again, Dr. Balu Shankaran, in 1987. Looking back into history, 1951, the world was in the midst of the worst polio epidemic in history. Schools closed, parents panicked, and the parents grew desperate for a vaccine. Fortunately, Salk vaccine, followed by Sabin vaccine, followed by improvement in the economic conditions of safe water supply and sanitation, reduced the incidence, and US saw its last wild virus polio case in 1979, and Europe saw it in 1998. India saw its last polio case in January 2011. When I joined my hospital in 1990, there were 3,000 new cases of paralytic poliomyelitis annually in the city of Delhi alone. Pan-India, it is guesstimated there were 40 to 50,000 new cases of polio across India every year. And that means there's a huge burden of cases back there. and many of them have been growing, and many of them are alive, and therefore there is a need for surgeons to continue to operate these cases. But in polio surgery, decision making is challenging, and understanding biomechanical linkages of spine, hip, knee, ankle, and foot is all complex. Knowledge is critical, but understanding linkages of muscle paralysis, gait, and posture needed experience in a full range of cases. And my teachers used to tell me, if you know poliomyelitis, Matthew, you know orthopedics, because it affects the whole system. Most common thing that I do is deformity correction. Unfortunately so, because the disease is preventable, the deformity is preventable, and the disability is preventable. And yet we see children crawling on all fours, children with a classical hand on thigh gait, children with deformities walking with a stick, children with severe deformities walking with crutches, and those that are severely paralyzed confined to their beds. And to see this kind of a gait is extremely painful. And that's my polio ward in the year 1992. Young children operated for various conditions, upper limb, lower limb, hip, everything. And boys and girls all in one ward. This is my polio ward today, just before my leaving for Birmingham. You see only women there. That's because the age profile of patients coming to me has changed. They are all young men and women, so we put them in separate wards. So there is a separate bed allocation for men, and these are the women's ward, 8 beds still fully occupied. What do I do when I treat polio patients? Basically trying to get them to be as independent as possible. And we do a spectrum of things. A typical example is the flexion deformity of the knee, soft tissue release, osteotomies, the Lazaroff, so many things are done. This young boy was brought to me with a request by his father, I want him to walk without crutches. I examined him, yes, hip release, knee release, and those days I was doing serial wedge corrections, did that, and got him straight, happy. Until then, the father was so grateful, he bought a box of offertory from the temple to give to me. So grateful. Until then, I did not understand that the crutch was associated with the stigma. And what I had done was change the stigma of this child from the family. Serial wedge correction, which I was doing and which is recommended in textbooks also, needs a weekly visit. And my patients started complaining, sorry sir, we can't come. Every day means 1 day's wage gone. We can't afford that. So, what do? You have to think of ways of doing alternative procedures. How do you simplify? So we thought and came out with this plaster distraction technique, which is a very simple technique. It needs a soft tissue release, followed by a pin insert in the upper tibia, followed by a cast, and behind the knee, the cast is cut. And a distractor, exactly like an Elizarov distractor, is put in. And the patient is sent home, distracts at the rate of 1 millimeter per day, and comes back with the knee completely straight. We did a biomechanical evaluation of this, and as long as the knee is 90-degree flexed, it is all force which is distracting, translating, and straightening. Once the knee is straightened out, it's all distracting. So a simple technique can change the profile of patient visit to the hospital and get the patient straight. This is a young girl undergoing the same technique, shaking hands with the previous president of India who visited my ward. And the girl had a complete correction, went home, 6 years down the line, came back, married, walking nicely with a single elbow crutch. Soft tissue release with simple traction is often done just to ensure that the joints remain supple. In India, in rural areas, all activities are done on the floor. They're sitting on the floor. They don't use tables and chairs. So it's important to retain the knee joint movement. So we had to use this technique. Every day, the patients have to have exercises and traction after soft tissue release to correct the deformity. This girl, all of 18, was brought to me at the back of her father's shoulder like a sack of potatoes and dumped on my examination table. Can you do something for her? Yes, after 3.5 months of traction, we could finally get her straight, and at the age of 19, she stood for the first time in her life. We need to adopt techniques to take care of needs of patients. Recurvatum knee is a very crippling deformity. It's gradually progressive. The soft tissue plication that is recommended normally tends to fail over a period of time. So this boy, he could not wear a brace even because of the severity of deformity. We did what is a proximal tibial osteotomy, correcting the deformity and getting the leg straight. That's the X-ray showing a hyperextension of the knee. That's the post-op X-ray where the proximal tibial flexion osteotomy has corrected it. This is 2 years follow-up. This is 10 years follow-up. Young man, walking straight, no deterioration, no worsening in the recurvatum deformity. We have now over 20-year follow-up in these cases, and it works. In long-standing cases with multiple surgeries, we have patients who have deformed knees. You cannot salvage the knee. Both knees are gone. What do? This man had attempted suicide 3 times. So we had to offer him only one procedure, and that is arthrodesis. So we did a bilateral arthrodesis, rather unconventional, to get it straight, get him standing upright, and go back to his village. Paralytic kyphoscoliosis, again, needs an expensive instrumentation, prolonged surgery, technical skills to be done, which most of these patients cannot access. This young boy was brought to me, father requesting me, can you get him better to send him to school? I examined him. He had severe paralysis of the trunk, severe paralysis of both the legs, and I said, I can't get him to walk. I'll give him a wheelchair. He can go in a wheelchair to the school. Father said, no, examine him again. Here is this young villager telling me, as a physician, please examine the patient again, you're missing something. So I looked at the patient again, and therein truth dawned on me. He's propping himself up with the support of his 2 hands. To sit in the class and write in the classroom, he has to use his hands, and his hands were not free to be used in the class. Therefore, I had to operate him. Those days, we were doing Harrington, and we did that, got him straight, got him upright, going back to school to write and be like his other peers. But many of them are not so fortunate. They end up in orphanages, crawling on all fours. And when she is sitting like this, that's a serpentine spine that you see, a severe deformity. And to get her, we have to do a complex surgery, which is expensive, which is difficult access for these patients, but we have been able to get support from Rotary and various other supporting organizations to do this procedure. Not the perfect correction, some of you can argue, but to get her standing upright and get that smile back and get the dignity of being on her 2 feet. Orthos is an important part of rehabilitation, but unfortunately, it is getting out of mainstream orthopedic surgery. This boy was using orthotic aids. 1 year down the line, I saw him without the orthotic aid. You have to train people in the use of orthotic devices. This child had never used the orthotic device which was given. The color of her skin on the leg is the same as the color of the mud on the floor. That's because she's crawling. She's never used the orthotic device. Repair of calipers. So we need to provide for these facilities based on the needs of the patient. And I learned this from the patients and interacting with them, and I try to adopt this in my ward. Huge calipers, but look at the 11,000-volt smile on her face. That's because of her ability to stand on her 2 legs. Can we make them better? They are so heavy, so cumbersome, so ugly. Yes, there is one design by Dr. P.K. Sethi, the flow reaction orthosis, which is far more cosmetic, which is based on a principle of alignment stability, biomechanically very sound principle. It is cosmetic, it can go inside the dress of the patient, and they can be used. Innovation based on patient needs. But we have modern technology. We are in a unique position in history where there's a juxtaposition of absolute high-tech technology with low-tech, completely absence of technology. How much more we can achieve if we adopt some of these, including 3D printing and robotics for these techniques, and make them accessible to the poor because they stay out of the whole stream. Camp surgeries. Many well-meaning people come in for camp surgeries recommending it because they want to reach out to a larger number. Yes, there is a large number out there, but we have had problems. And this young girl had a camp surgery for a flexion deformity of an osteotomy of the knee and ended up with a gangrene of the leg, a dreaded complication. And all I could do was an amputation. She came to me hearing that I probably can do something. The amputation was done. The parents said, we are not taking her back home because we can't take her back home without the leg. There's a huge stigma for an amputee. So I said, okay, I'll get her walking with prosthesis, got it in-house, and got the prosthesis done, made and fitted and standing, and got her walking and sent her back to the village. 3 years down the line, this young woman came with this little baby for fever for the baby. I had not recognized it is the same woman with a prosthetic leg who had got married and come back from a distant city to show her little baby to me. We do not recommend camp surgeries, I'm learning, because there is a need for institution-based surgeries where there's a team approach, PT, OT, orthotist, surgeon, nursing care. Everything has to be available, accessible to the patient. The next thing that I started doing was clubfoot, and it's sheer serendipity that happened. Conventionally, they are treated by cast, but many of them do not correct, and they get operations. This young boy was shown to be in a northeastern state. The headmaster of the school heard that I was there, and he asked me, can you do something? And he also asked me, do you know the nickname of this boy? I said, no. My nickname was Reverse Gear. His classmates called him Reverse Gear because his toes pointed 180 degrees backwards when he stood and walked. Children can be cruel by innocence. I said, yes, we operated multiple surgeries. Look at the scars. I didn't like the scars that were there from previous surgery, so I had to use this technique, got him straight, and got him back in forward gear. In India, every 10 minutes a child is born with clubfoot. That's a huge number. Health is a state subject. So the Prime Minister sitting in Delhi cannot order things to be done in each of the states. They have to go with the Chief Minister of the state. There is no uniform policy for birth defects. There's a large number of untreated cases out there. 50,000 children born every year means a huge backlog. This is one clinic of mine, a spectrum from less than 1 to 15, all with club feet, wanting correction. What did we want? To ensure that every child gets quality care. To reach out to everyone, we then thought we have to use a public health model. And herein, with the availability of Ponseti's method, we had an opportunity. So we started the whole Ponseti model for training doctors in Ponseti's technique, getting counselors to take care of these children, and providing free brace to every one of them. And one by one, we have been opening clinics across the country. Each red dot in the map of India represents the clinic run by the program that we have. We are there in every state in India. That's the list of breakdowns, and we can say proudly there are over 49,000 children under the program in the last 9 years. That's a bunch of kids treated for clubfoot with the current President of India at a function that we had. We have a football team made out of children treated for clubfoot, competing with another normal feet-born children. That's the match where the two sets of kids, you can't differentiate between the two. And that was the learning that we had. The older patients with clubfoot, once we saw the results that it is working beautifully, we attempted to stretch the limit to older and older patients. And we are now going up to 12 to 14 years because our results are so good. This young girl of 11 years had partially treated clubfoot with a residual deformity. She came to us like this in 2013. That's the deformity that she had. That's how her foot was. That's how it looked from the plantar surface. With just Ponseti casting, about 12 casts, we were able to correct the deformity, and the only surgery that I did on her was a tenotomy at the back that you can see. But what I could not change, the mother asked me at the end of the procedure, can you get the feet to be the same size? I said, unfortunately, no, they have to be different sizes. That's the advantage I taught her, that you need to have early treatment for this, the 2 feet to be the same size. What about tenotomy in the older children? Conventionally, we have been doing tendo-Achilles lengthening. Can we do a tenotomy in the older child? Can they walk tiptoe post-tenotomy? Here is this young woman, 23 years old, residual deformity after casting just at the time of tenotomy, done under local anesthesia. And you don't see the usual pop that you normally see with a small child's tenotomy. We only feel a gap, and that's the same woman walking 6 months down the line on tiptoe. After a complete transaction of the tendo-Achilles, you can walk on tiptoe on the floor comfortably. So we understood the genius of Ponseti's technique, and I'm learning. Understood that it could be extended to older children. Understood that tenotomy is useful. We also have to do research, and quite often research, while it is global science, we need to use the science locally. So we need to use that locally. And one of the most important things in India is to sit on the floor. A person with a total hip replacement has trouble sitting on the floor. Intracapsular fracture neck femur, if we do a THR, we don't routinely tell them to sit on the floor. 1931, Robert Jones, fracture of the neck is a grave condition. It's an unsolved fracture. And the part of the failure to solve this has been the lack of your ability to pick up an avascular femoral head on day 1. Until now, there has been no reliable method. A technique which is pushed by Japanese orthopedic surgeons, Konoshike et al., dynamic perfusion MRI. We found this could be used for checking vascular status, did this as a research project where we gave gadolinium and looked at a time sequence change of the signal characteristics of the femoral head of the fractured side compared with the unfractured side. And the two sides on comparison gave us a clue. A graph was plotted, and we had 3 types of graphs that were plotted. Type A curve, vascular. Type B curve, vascular, yet with lesser vascularity. And type C curve with poor vascularity. And we did the study where we looked at fracture neck femurs. All of them had dynamic MRIs, and we did the conventional treatment without teaching in the treatment protocol. And we looked at the outcomes. Amazing. The worst outcome were all the ones who had type C curve. We were really fascinated by the outcome. Sensitivity of 87%, specificity of 88%, and standard use for follow-up was X-rays. But then when we looked at avascularity, the gold standard for avascularity is tetracycline labeling. So we thought we must do a study with tetracycline labeling. So how do we do that? So we had a tetracycline labeling done in 60 patients, all of them going in for prosthetic replacement for a fracture neck femur as per classical indications. And then examine this under fluorescent microscope. And we found 3 types of fluorescence: excellent, good, and none. And then we compared. The pathologist did not know which was the case which had a type A curve. It was blinded. So when we finally put the 2 results together, we found type A curves correlated beautifully, 100%, with the excellent fluorescence. Type B curves not 100%, but almost 95% correlating. And type C curves correlated almost 100% with the poor vascularity. Here was an opportunity to decide about saving or sacrificing femoral head, and we have all an algorithm based on this, and research is continuing in this area. This was a young lady doctor of 55 years who came to me with a fractured neck femur, who had been to corporate hospitals and other medical college hospitals. She had an impacted fractured neck, confirmed by a CT scan, confirmed by an MRI, had a fractured neck femur, and she was told she needs a total hip replacement. And she was petrified that she's going to have a hip replacement at the age of 55. She came to me. I asked her only one thing clinically: she could do straight leg raising. She could do that. That means it is confirmed it is an impacted fractured neck. I asked for a dynamic MRI, did that. It was a type A curve. Type A curve, that's her figures that we have here. And I told her, just continue to walk with the stick, nothing else. This is a 2-year follow-up. Fractures healed. She does everything under the sun, sits cross-legged, sits squatting and everything. No problem. So you need to do relevant research wherever it is essential. Injury prevention work. I was initiated into this work by Professor Dinesh Mohan, my mentor in this. And people ask me, how do you get involved into this? You're a clinician. Why are you involved in this? No, I have to be involved because in India, in any public hospital, the beds are occupied by road traffic injury victims. Globally, 1.25 million people die, and tens of millions of people are injured or disabled as a result of road traffic injuries. Therefore, if I want to free those beds and free them for my other patients that need care, I need to be part of the program for prevention of injuries. And I also learned that injury prevention is not a common sense intuitive science. It is a very, very deliberate science which has a solid foundation. The number of lives affected are too large, and we need to take actions which will influence communities. But over the years, in the last 30 years we have been working in this field, we have realized governments and decision makers make policies that have a conflict of interest. The highways, the international aid organizations. Therefore, we decided we are not being able to make an impact, so we created an independent council of Road Safety International of well-meaning people around the world. And we provide rapid, independent and evidence-based information on road safety policy. We strengthen the capacity of safety professionals and policy makers to understand existing evidence and undertake new research. We also facilitate capacity building for safety professionals and policy makers by holding training camps and also providing literature on this. These are the founding members, chaired by a UK MP, Barry Shearman, and these are the members of the committee. Every injury saved prevents a bed from being occupied by a road traffic injury victim, and therefore, as surgeons and physicians, we have a responsibility to society to do that. We have to do a public health approach. We work on patients one at a time. One starfish at a time we are saving. But the use of public health approach can reach out to many more. While I did surgery on 600 patients in a year, the Rotary partnered with the government of India and were able to eradicate poliomyelitis from the whole face of India. 2011 was the last case. Their achievement is global and nationally huge. I do dream and hope that the world tomorrow is free from poliomyelitis. There is a social impact that is associated. Medicine is a social science, and politics is nothing but medicine on a larger scale. The first task of the doctor is therefore political. The struggle against disease must begin with a war against bad governance, bad management, bad community decisions, bad policy decisions. Michael Foucault, the philosopher, gave this. Health is grounded in social context, so therefore we must correlate the two constantly. We have, as surgeons and physicians, an opportunity to change lives. Are we measuring up? we can remove stigmas, we can change physical capacities, and we can enable each to reach the summit of their dreams. Yesterday, we saw a poignant narration of a life story of a triple amputee. That's in a resource-rich context. Another resource-poor context, bilateral landmine victim amputation, double amputee. And he came totally depressed. We had to do multiple surgeries on him and got him to this level. I didn't show the gruesome slides. And got him with a very, very basic prosthesis. And got him standing. It took us 3 months to get him standing on his feet and having balance. And finally, to discard his both elbow crutches. And he was so proud of discarding his crutches that he immediately did some judo karate maneuvers and showed to us. Again, talents abound. Human spirit. This girl is a fine painter. She paints beautifully, confined to her bed. She's never walked. She has severe paralysis of both legs, her trunk, and her upper limb. So she cannot even use a regular walker or a crutch. So this patient, she has been to several art exhibitions. Her portfolios are displayed here. And she said only one thing, can you get me even with some support to get to me on my feet so that when I show my artworks to people that are visiting my exhibition, I am at their level, not at a lower level. Well, it took us several efforts. This particular mobility aid had to be procured from Belgium. And we had well-wishers taking care of this. This young girl came to me with a typical hand-on-thigh gait of poliomyelitis. It is only when she was admitted in the ward, I learned from the nurses, she is a national champion for arm wrestling. I hadn't known that. Well, she got corrected and went home happily. I didn't hear from her till about last week when 2 more patients came and they said, how did you come? I asked them. They said, no, we were referred by this girl. I said, okay. Now what is she doing now? The spirit of human endeavor never dies. She got upright, she got standing to walk independently, and she now started badminton training. And I was told by those patients that came to me saying that she's been selected for the National Paralympics team for badminton. Imagine, from arm wrestling, as soon as she got the opportunity to stand on her feet, she's moved from arm wrestling to badminton and now got selected in the Paralympics team. This beautiful girl, paralyzed both legs and spine, I had treated her, called me up in the outpatient, doctor, will you be there? I said, yes. I am coming to meet you. I said, okay. When she came, she had a box full of chocolates. I said, is it your birthday? She said, no. She showed me this picture. And that is, I have been crowned Miss Wheelchair Delhi. She was proud about it, and I felt happy. End of the day, what matters is how did you impact society? How did you help change the life of a fellow human being? Life is defined not by what it is, but by what it is not. Thank you very much. When people talk to you, they want that you should leave footprints in the sands of time. But I think it is far more important to restore dignity of our fellow human beings. That's my hospital, more than a century old, St. Stephen's Hospital in Delhi, the oldest hospital, a stamp issued at the centenary year. Thank you very much.